Welcome. Good evening. So glad to see you here at the DC History Center. My name is Jane F. Levy, and I am the managing editor of Washington History Magazine, the DC History Center's publication. We are so pleased to present tonight's author talk, Gay is Good, Frank Kameny and the Fight for LGBTQ Rights, with Eric Cervini. Eric is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Deviant War, the Homosexual versus the United States of America. This author interview is part of the DC History Center's Context for Today series of online conversations with thoughtful and thought-provoking historians. So here's our format. I will interview Eric for about 40 minutes. During that time, we invite you to send questions as they occur to you by using the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. At the end of 40 minutes, we will turn to your questions and comments. Now, I'd like to invite our author, Eric Cervini, to join me on screen. Hey, Eric, how you doing?
Well, hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, delighted to see you. I'm going to tell everybody your credentials, and then we'll get started. Eric Cervini is a Harvard graduate who earned a PhD at the University of Cambridge in 2019. That's where the Deviant's War began life. It was his PhD dissertation. Today, as an authority on 1960s gay activism, Cervini serves on the board of directors of the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus and also on the board of advisors of the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C. I learned while prepping for this evening that in addition to being a relentless researcher and a wicked wordsmith, Eric is also a social media star. He has a large following for his posts of easily digested information on LGBTQ history and issues. For many of us viewing this evening, though, rest assured, The Deviant's War is a masterful work of scholarship. Eric has made use of dynamic firsthand accounts, newly declassified FBI records, and some 40,000 personal documents to craft this book. And it's also a page turner. So, to start off, Eric, why did you get involved with this topic?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you again for having me, Jane. It's truly an honor to be here, and Maggie and Ann and everyone at the DC History Center. And I don't think I can pick a better place to be, and especially a question to answer first, because, you know, I think we have to go all the way back to 1995 with David K. Johnson's very first academic article on Frank Kameny in the Washington History Magazine that really introduced, I think, Frank, who was still around, to the entire world, into all of academia, showing us just how much history is contained within one man. And of course, that became the Lavender Scare. It introduced me in undergrad to the story of Frank Kameny. Unfortunately, he passed away just a couple of years before I discovered his story, and I had seen these descriptions of him, and of course David's chapter on him, about him being the grandfather of the gay rights movement, and yet there wasn't a book about him. And so for 8 years, I kind of dove in, specifically, and most of my time was spent at the Library of Congress, but also the Rainbow History Project was invaluable. And I know y'all are the home of that archive, and so many people were kind enough to share their stories, knowing Frank and working with Frank. And I've seen some people even in this Zoom, including Rick and Craig, who knew the man and worked with him and understood the weight of him as a historical figure and also as a personality. And so I really relied on so many different people and sources in order to build who I imagined he was from the ground up. And so it really was a group effort, and I'm so grateful for everyone who was willing to share their bits and pieces of queer history in Washington.
So can you tell us why you were interested in queer history to begin with?
Well, I'm originally from Central Texas, a little town called Round Rock outside of Austin, and I came out right before college, just a few weeks beforehand, and I thought I was pretty well versed in American history. It was one of my favorite subjects. I thought I was going to go to law school. And, even in undergrad, I was taking these wonderful classes, studying all different facets of our country's history. And it wasn't until I happened to watch the film Milk about Harvey Milk that I realized that something was missing in my education. And so it was actually Hollywood, I'm based in Los Angeles now, that introduced me to this other world. There wasn't a queer history 101 at Harvard, at least at the time. There is now. But it got me wondering, how in the world was I not taught this story of Harvey Milk, which is, supposed to be and should be one of the most important tragic stories in American history, at least of an individual politician. And I wasn't taught that. So therefore, what other stories must be out there? And so the book actually started as an urban history project because I needed a topic. At first, I thought I was going to write about Milk and his use of public space in San Francisco, but I couldn't make it out there. And as I was looking at related figures on the library database, I saw a name I didn't recognize, and that was Frank Kameny, and started digging, who was this guy? Why wasn't I taught about him? And come to find out, the Frank Kameny Papers project had just recently facilitated the donation of his papers to the Library of Congress, the largest individual LGBTQ plus collection in the world that I know of. And I bust down to Washington and realized I was looking at the hidden history of queer rights in America, because he truly kept everything that he ever, every letter he received or sent, he had a copy. Every copy of a pre-Stonewall homophile publication, he kept a copy. And so it really was a long, long process, but one I'll always cherish.
Well, that is the historian's dream, is to find
Yes.
individual like that. And it was evidently very well kept. And you said in your book, if you put the papers in a stack, it was a 6-story building height of papers you went through. Is that right?
Yes. Well, that's how much is in the collection. So I was only able to go through a tiny, tiny portion of that. So even though it's 40,000 documents, I think overall it's probably 500,000 that are in there. And so I hope, if anything, people read the book or listen to this conversation and say, well, Eric covered the 60s in DC, but we still need the 70s. We still need a comprehensive history of AIDS activism in Washington. We still need to understand the marriage fight and who was left behind in the 90s and 2000s in Washington. There are so many bits and pieces of Washington's local queer history that still need to be told. And so I hope people will, once the archives are back open, will take advantage of them.
Right. You've touched on a couple of terms I'd like to ask you to define for us.
Sure.
I know that when I was reading the book, it starts off with the term homosexual. And then we go through time and the terms change. So can you explain which ones you prefer to use right now and what we'll use as we have this conversation?
It's a great question. You know what? My own language has evolved over time, just as it has within history. I think, like so many people, and I'm sure some older generations who maybe even on this call aren't as comfortable with the word queer. And it's really been younger generations of scholars and even younger activists who have reclaimed the word and said it's actually very useful, very similar to the word deviant, which is actually why I use that word in the title, is because it doesn't exclude anyone. Deviant can be applied to a homosexual, as Frank Kameny identified himself, but it also can be applied to all the different deviant groups who transgress norms of gender and sexuality. So people who are also in the book, like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, who maybe we wouldn't necessarily now refer to them as a homosexual. Deviant is still a tongue-in-cheek way to refer to being queer, but now I would certainly use the word queer when I'm talking about the umbrella term, and it's simply easier to say than LGBTQ plus. But I think it's so fluid within our past and of how language has evolved to refer to different identities, and it's changing right now. And so I always tend to be flexible in whatever people are comfortable with using.
Okay, well, I think that you just made it easier for me, and I'll use the word queer in the way that
Great.
you defined as we go
I
forward.
appreciate it.
Okay, so let's get back to Frank Kameny. In 1957, he lost his U.S. government job for being a homosexual, and that's the beginning of the story. And thousands of federal employees were fired for the same reason. They left quietly, right? And their lives were ruined professionally, most of them. Why is it that Kameny fought his dismissal when the others didn't?
Well, for the people who knew him, who might be on this call, they would say, well, that was just Frank. I mean, he truly was raised. He was from Queens in New York. Knew from a very early age that he wanted to be an astronomer, and an astronomer he would become. And he did absolutely everything that he needed to do to get to his ambitions. And so he gets his Harvard PhD in 1956. And for many people like him who are at the top of his field, graduated from Harvard, were white, straight passing, he believed, quite frankly, that he was entitled to having a job as an astronomer. And frankly, he probably was. There were only a few dozen astronomers with that sort of education. This is in the same year, 1957, as the launch of Sputnik. And so he looked around and quite rationally said, well, the government certainly needs astrophysicists like me. I've worked 20 years to get to this position. It's very clear there is a demand for people like me, and I deserve to be there. And I think you also have to acknowledge, like I mentioned, his privilege that came with his identity of being white, straight passing, and being cis. He felt like he deserved to be in the federal government. And so when that was taken away from him, it was unfathomable for him. And it really started, I think that it was a combination of that entitlement, but also just how irrational the government's reasoning was in his mind, for someone who's so preoccupied with logic and reason and the scientific method. When the government can only provide for its reason for persecuting him of irrational prejudice, right? Because prejudice is always going to be irrational for someone who's so tied to logic and is in all elements of his life. He would time the time it takes to get in between from his house to various stoplights. There were these eccentricities of everything being very, very important to him, that things were logical. And so when you're confronted with something being taken for you with no valid reason, I think something kind of just glitched. And he said, this is absolutely not right. And I'm going to fight back. I refuse to take any other job that is less than being an astronomer, because that would imply that I could survive, that it's okay what the government's doing to me. And so, like you said, he became the first to fight back, at least within the US judicial system, first to take his case to the Supreme Court, and really laid the foundations for at least the legal fight for gay rights for the next decade.
And what you're saying about his personality is really, really important here. I think that is a huge part of what made it possible for him to have the accomplishments that he had ultimately. But as you note in the book, he wasn't easy to get along with, right? He was a tough one. Also in the book, just to get a little context here, this is a quote from the book. You said that in the late 1940s, the police in DC conducted a, quote, sex perversion elimination program, unquote. And also between 1945 and 1960, 1 million homosexuals were arrested in the United States, or one every 10 minutes. How was this possible? What was going on at the time in our country?
Well, this is where that term, the lavender scare, really comes into play. And what people don't realize is, at the same time, right after World War II, that Joseph McCarthy and his Republican allies were trying to delegitimize the Truman administration by claiming that there was this threat from within of communists or their sympathizers infiltrating our government. They were making parallel claims, arguing that homosexuals had also infiltrated our government, and that those homosexuals, in their words, or sexual deviants or perverts, so many beautiful words were used at the time, because of their sexual deviance, they were susceptible mostly to being blackmailed by foreign agents, and therefore were just as much of a security risk as an actual Soviet agent. But then on top of that was their claims that they were just simply immoral, and very similar to what you hear within the military and with Don't Ask, Don't Tell of disrupting the workplace or morale. That was also superimposed into their reasoning. So you can see over and over again in the book, Frank and his allies are having to deal with so many different layers of reasoning and prejudice that simply don't make sense. But at the end of the day, all of these modes of persecution were political tools. They were to bring the Republicans back to power after 2 decades out of the White House, and they were successful. There were, Eisenhower ran on the campaign slogan, "Let's clean house," and his opponent, Adlai Stevenson, there were rumors that he was gay. And so, of course, there's so many different ways that this lavender scare was not just ruined lives, but it also helped a lot of people on the other side. And I think we have to be really cognizant of that. And then on top of that, there's at the local level, every single major city had vice squads or morals divisions that really their sole purpose, at least for some of the officers within them, were to dress in tight-fitting clothes and be stationed in the middle of the night at public restrooms or public parks like Lafayette Square and try to entrap sexual deviants and homosexuals. And this was happening all across the country, not to mention bar raids, not to mention witch hunts of other sorts that happen within the military and within other local agencies. And so you have this patchwork that are multi-layered levels of persecution that are happening during this time. And that's really the crux of the lavender scare.
And that affected everyone. We had from you a picture of a headline that I hope that we can show right now on the screen, although we were having a little bit of trouble earlier with our technology. So we'll see if that turns up. I think it's turning up. Here we go.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, this is, do you remember what newspaper or magazine this was from?
I want to say it was Confidential magazine. I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure.
Okay, and can you talk about how people interpreted this?
Right. Well, this case is actually really interesting because this was in 61. It was 2 NSA analysts who were pretty low level, very similar situation as Edward Snowden, where they simply ran off with a whole bunch of government secrets. And there were allegations that they may have been gay. So they show up in Moscow a few weeks later, announcing all these super secretive programs that are extremely embarrassing for the US government. And the one thing, even though there's no evidence, the one thing that the press and the politicians on both sides, partisan or nonpartisan, leapt on was that they were gay. And that the reason that they were so willing to give away government secrets was because they were A, immoral, and B, unstable because of their sexual deviance. And the timing was quite terrible for Frank Kameny because this was right when he was in the middle of appealing his dismissal from the Army Map Service. And suddenly there's this whole new fiasco within the government of these 2 gay men supposedly causing the biggest security breach in American history. And so it wasn't ideal timing for him, but it just shows, this is 10 years after the launch of the Lavender Scare. And even though McCarthy was dead by now, you can see how the language was so, and the reasoning and the persecution was so enduring, even though our traditional Red Scare had died down a little bit.
Enduring and inflammatory and really scary. And one of the pleasures of your book, Eric, I have to say, is that you do show us the coincidence of things. And Frank, something happens in Frank's life, and then, as you just pointed out, something else was happening in the larger arena, which had a huge impact on him personally, in ways that most people don't really feel most of us operate in the world and the world happens around us, but it doesn't impact us personally in the same way.
Exactly.
So that's a nice feature of your book. So let's get back to Frank and let's get him to Washington. You had offered to read a section from your book describing what gay Washington was like when he arrived in 1957.
Sure, I will pull it up. All right. Kameny arrived in Washington without knowing any homosexuals in that city, so he remedied the problem systematically. I simply proceeded to go to gay bars every single night, 7 days a week, he later explained. He researched the locations of the city's gay bars and began collecting data on the foreign world of gay Washington. He concluded it was most efficient to meet people in quantity, not quality. Then, after a year or so, he would have the raw material to build a social life of his own. The nucleus of gay Washington had long been Lafayette Square, the public park immediately adjacent to the White House. In the early 19th century, the square contained pens for enslaved people. And in 1885, after the city decided to keep the park open all night, men began appearing there for sex. It was a logical location, downtown, dark, and with plenty of trees for cover. By the early 20th century, men of all backgrounds knew where to go for a sexual encounter with other men. The gay bars of 1950s Washington, however, were peculiar places. After Prohibition ended, Congress, which directly controlled the Capitol's laws, technically outlawed all bars, and only restaurants could attain liquor licenses in the district. The law also required patrons to remain seated as they consumed alcohol. If patrons wanted to change seats, a server would move their drinks for them. All such establishments closed at midnight on Saturdays and Sundays. The gay bars for white men opened downtown, not far from Lafayette Square. Though Washington did not enact its own Jim Crow laws, de facto segregation reigned in the establishments that constituted the gay scene. The Chicken Hut, for example, did not serve Black customers until a 1953 Supreme Court decision. And even then, it placed reserve signs on tables to tell African Americans that there was no room for them. In total, by the time Kameny arrived in 1956, Washington had no fewer than 17 bars that primarily catered to homosexuals, including the 2 bars open to gay Black men located in the Columbia Heights and Shaw neighborhoods. White men like Kameny, however, did not venture there. His world, the world of downtown gay bars, was white. Fear of persecution seeped into each of the establishments. The policing of gay Washington began as early as the 1890s, when officials installed lighting around monuments and increased overnight officer patrols in the interest of morality. In 1946, the US Park Police established an investigative unit, which included 6 plainclothesmen who secretly monitored public restrooms. Washington's Metropolitan Police established a morals division with 4 undercover policemen tasked solely with finding and arresting homosexuals. Never a week went by, one gay Washington resident remembered, where you didn't read the Washington Post and it would come out with someone who was picked up in one of the parks for soliciting. Police arrested 1 victim per day during the sex perversion elimination program of 1947. The Washington police in the 1950s commonly assaulted or arrested those who cross-dressed, especially drag queens of color. Drag shows primarily took place in straight bars rather than gay bars, which did not dare draw attention to themselves. As one Black drag queen later remembered, the police like to just jump out on you and, making a thumping sound, do you anyway, tear your clothes off, take your wig off. After repeatedly resisting police brutality, she eventually left Washington, fearing that the police, if she fought back once more, would kill her. But the authorities tolerated the white bars of downtown gay Washington. As long as their patrons followed the rules, no standing, no dancing, no drag, they could exist in the spaces they had created themselves, a world in the shadow of the White House.
Really, really lovely, Eric. Thank you.
Okay.
Just to go on from there, because we have so many things to talk about, how hard was it for you to put that information together? Where did you get it?
That information specifically?
Yeah.
Well, thankfully, so much of that section in particular came from another wonderful book that I'd encourage everyone to read, which is called The Queer Capital by Jenny Beeman. She spent so many years doing the hard work of looking at the police reports and finding these amazing archival sources from the 19th century, going all the way back to them installing the lights in Lafayette Square. And so I'm really indebted to her for that section, but also One thing to remember, as this section talks about, is these newspapers, including the Washington Post, would report on these statistics and on these arrests because it was good news. You know, it was like, hey, the local government is doing its job, and it was newsworthy. It was scandalous. And so anytime there were these big dragnets of sexual deviance that were then reprinted in the Post or other outlets, it was certainly going to be publicized, and people would pick up the news and find out who amidst them were were deviants.
Wow. Okay. Um, you guys already said that Kameny was a very logical guy, and he was a scientist, and he fought with the government and saying that their views of homosexuality were irrational and they were emotional. So what did he say to refute those objections? You mentioned all the lawsuits that he brought, including all the way to the Supreme Court at one point. How did he refute the government's view of homosexuality?
I'm glad you asked, because that's actually my dissertation had a different title, which was called The Proud Plaintiff. And that, I think, if there's one thing that Frank should be remembered for, at least in the historiographical context, is his invention of that role. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned, he was confronted with two different strains of reasoning from the government. First, if you were queer, you were necessarily immoral. And second, you were a security risk because you had a secret. You were necessarily going to be susceptible to blackmail. So we said, all right, that is clearly arbitrary and unconstitutional. So what he did when he wrote his own cert petition to take to the Supreme Court, because his lawyer wouldn't have anything to do with it by that point, he said, all right, I'm going to make an arbitrary argument of my own. And in doing so, it's going to prove that the government's reasoning is itself arbitrary. So he just simply inversed the reasoning. So the government said that if you're gay, you're immoral. Well, he said, well, I'm going to write in my Supreme Court petition that actually to be homosexual is inherently moral. It's a moral good. It's contributing beneficially to society. And second, the government was saying, well, he's secretive. He's susceptible to blackmail. Well, he inverted that and he said, well, I have the opportunity to either submit this lawsuit as anonymous versus Brucker, the Secretary of the Army, or I could do so openly, knowing full well that the Washington Post will likely cover it, that this will be a scandal, that I will never have a job in federal government or academia ever again. And so he filed his lawsuit as Franklin Edward Kameny versus Edward Brucker, the Secretary of the Army. And he did that very specifically with a legal rationale being, how could the government possibly claim that he would be susceptible to blackmail if the entire world, all the media knew that he was openly gay? He was declaring being gay was morally good, and he was doing it as his public, authentic self. And so what I argue in my dissertation, and more implicitly in the book, is that this is 1961. This is, Pride as we know it. The first Pride March isn't until 1970, a year after Stonewall. And so what I argue is that reasoning, what began in a courtroom, in a legal argumentation, actually grew over time as he started attracting other proud plaintiffs to replicate his case. Then suddenly you start to see all across the country more and more people making those two exact same arguments. And this is, a full decade before Stonewall. And, I still think it took Stonewall for it to be truly an open liberationist movement for everyone. Because if you look at the photographs, I'm sure you have some of what the people looked like, what those plaintiffs looked like. They looked like Frank Kameny. They were people who owned suits, who were white, who were able to get in the door in the first place. So it really took Stonewall and to really create a massive mobilization that really enabled gay liberation and pride as we know it for the entire country.
And his arguments were hard for people to deal with at first. I mean, because we're dealing with a population who had to maintain their secrecy. And it's just remarkable that he was able to persuade them to go from being secretive and anonymous and not showing up to picket anywhere to turning out and being public about who they were and what they wanted. Here we have the picture of 1965 of members of the Mattachine Society of Washington, which Frank founded, picketing at the White House. And they were incredibly brave people to do this, right? I mean, you talked about who they were and how they were in situations where they could afford to do this. I mean, Frank himself was unemployed for so much of his life and often literally hungry. That these people were lucky that they were able to support themselves and have jobs or some other way of keeping themselves together. And so he was really brave to go public with his ideas. And that I like the way you described it, that he inverted the government's argument and he showed it just to be irrational. How
Exactly.
long did it take for the movement to pick up on his ideas, though, Eric? Did it take a while?
It did take a while, and I'd say, you know, it was very incremental. You see, even in 1961, even with the filing of the Supreme Court petition, he's terrified. You know, he knows that this could ruin his life, and so even though he wants to inspire other people to emulate his legal tactics, which had never really been done, some cases in California involving obscenity laws, but to actually proclaim that his civil liberties were being deprived had never been done. And so, but as soon as he submits this petition and you start to see it circulate all across the country, and you see one magazine, for example, publishes it in entirety because they were just shocked that that's A, no one had done it before, and B, that the audacity of this man. And soon other plaintiffs start joining his crusade. Similar people with, you know, people who had maybe money in the family and, you know, other resources, but when it came to employment, nothing to lose, right? People like Bruce Scott, people like Cliff Norton, who also lost their jobs. And then, you know, especially in the case of Bruce Scott, very similar situation. He lost his job just a few years after Frank Kameny. His case, as the homophile press is expanding in size, they start selling his petition, his lawsuit. If anyone's familiar with the magazine Drum, they were selling it for $1 a pop. And so it's as there were more and more of these plaintiffs who were willing to take that step, very similar to picketing, who were willing to be photographed and put on, you know, one of the front pages of the Washington Post or the Chicago Sun-Times. Suddenly, it's less terrifying, right? Because you see these people survived. Yeah, it was horrifying, that very first picket that you saw, but you know, no one came and attacked them. That's what they genuinely thought would happen, was that, you know, they'd be attacked either by the police for good reason, or by onlookers who were angry and would attack them for good reason. And that didn't happen, which showed, you know, America was changing, but it also proved to other people who were witnessing it that if they took a stand, then maybe they would be all right too. So it really was a snowball effect, and I think it really culminated probably in 1968 when Frank Kameny heard the cheers of "Black is Beautiful," right, coined by Stokely Carmichael and those within the Black Power movement, and said, hey, this is very similar to what I've been claiming within our movement, that being gay is morally good. So he heard that and translated it to gay is good. And so I always like to refer to Frank as being the Xerox machine of our movement, of looking to the Black freedom movement. 1961, when he was coming up with these ideas, where did he get those ideas? Well, what else was happening just the year prior? The Greensboro sit-ins, right, where you see students who were wearing, dressed very conservatively, told by organizers in the South to dress as if they were going to church. Because what were they doing? They were inverting the claims of morality that white racist segregationists had long been making, and saying, actually, you all are the immoral ones. We're the moral ones who are simply just trying to have a hamburger. And Frank saw that and applied it to our movement. He did the same thing with Gay is Good. But I think it took really Stonewall for it to be applied to it, and opened up for those who also existed at the intersection of those movements. And I think that's something we have to acknowledge as well.
Right, and we're getting into the, when you talk about Stonewall, we're getting into the later part of the 60s. So there are all of these societal changes happening.
Right.
That last picture that we showed where Frank is marching with a sign that says gay is good, it's one of the first ones that I've seen where he wasn't wearing a suit and tie.
Right.
That was loosening up. and trying to get with the younger kids. We're going to be running tight on time, so I wanted to just get to a couple of really key points here. You follow a number of legal challenges that Kameny brought against the government, which we talked about a bit. What was the legal turning point that allowed the restoration of jobs for those fired for homosexuality? Which case was that, and how did that get won?
I think probably one of the most important was Norton versus Macy, which was actually decided, I believe it was 2 or 3 days after Stonewall. So it's this poetic intersection of on the ground grassroots organizing against police brutality and anti-blackness and queerness, and then also this parallel legal fight that was happening, within the ACLU, in the Mattachine Society in Washington. And it just shows what an essential year 1969 really was. And of course, even though the appeals court rules that this man Cliff Norton, who actually works for NASA, who had called up Frank Kameny, asked for help as soon as it happened, and was guided by him and with the assistance of the ACLU, the Capital Area chapter, all the way until 69. The government didn't really change its policies. It took another 6 years for that to happen in a series of other lawsuits, including a class action one by some of Frank's other plaintiffs, for that to really force the arm of the government. And finally, the Civil Service Commission surrendered in 1975. But even then, within the military, within some of the more sensitive agencies like the FBI and the CIA, that wasn't overturned until the 1990s, until the Clinton administration. And then, of course, within the government for the past several years until really a few weeks ago, trans service members weren't allowed to serve the country. And so it just showed, and now we're dealing with the Republican Party's war on trans children across the country. And so it just shows that this isn't new, right? What's happening, and in times when those without power want to gain it, a very easy way is to find a scapegoat. And in the 50s and 60s, it was the sexual deviant, and right now it's trans children. And so I think it just shows that now that people who are white and cis and male within our movement, now that we're benefiting from the activism of people like Frank and those who fought at Stonewall, now it's our turn to say, okay, now we need to be the loudest and most supportive and vocal in elevating those who are being attacked right now.
So it certainly is not over yet. I just wanted to circle back for a moment because we went through it quickly. But so you had 69, you had the Norton case, and then 75 is when the Civil Service Commission no longer made it illegal for homosexuals to be government employees.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have those other increments. There's one other one that I wanted you to talk about, and that is the American Psychiatric Association and their influence on the issues and lives of queer people in America. Can you tell us that story? What happened?
Sure. There's a wonderful documentary that I'd suggest to everyone, if you want more after this and after you read the book, that actually has the support of the Mattachine Society of Washington, the modern day one called Cured, C-U-R-E-D, that really tells that story. And that's after 1971, Frank Kameny actually runs for Congress and really shows that there's a gay voting bloc within DC. Mattachine is replaced with a new organization called the Gay and Lesbian Activist Alliance. I see some members of it in the audience. And Frank kind of pivoted after that to a new target. Now that he had the ACLU and some of these other organizations fighting the government, he said, well, the government often points to the psychiatric industry and those like Charles Socarides and so many other psychotherapists who claimed that if you were gay, then you were necessarily sick, right? Which also made you susceptible to blackmail and being unfaithful and all these other issues that were in that web of prejudice. And he was successful. He, utilizing a variety of tactics, he and Barbara Giddings and so many other activists by 1973 were able to prove to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, that that queerness, that homosexuality should not be in the DSM, the manual of psychiatric disorders. And so it's a whole nother saga. I really stop right at the end of the Mattachine, so I don't cover it as much in my book, but that documentary Cured really takes it's really the sequel, I think, spiritually in telling that history.
I'd like to show a picture that I found really marvelous from that particular issue. This is the uh, American Psychiatric Association meeting in 1971, I believe, in Washington, D.C. at the Shoreham Hotel, for all of you local people. And you can see in the background a lot of, looks like a lot of straight white men in suits. And in the foreground, you have a certain amount of turmoil going on. Can you describe quickly what happened and who those people in front are and what they're doing?
Sure. It's one of my favorite photos, I think, in all of history, and especially when you compare it to that 1965 march of everyone suited and in ties in front of the White House silently, and you compare it to this. And Frank Kameny was one of the leaders of this demonstration. They literally invaded that ballroom, the American Psychiatric Association conference that was happening in Washington. They pried open the doors. You can see, if you look really closely, some of them are in drag. Frank Kameny grabbed the microphone and declared war on the psychiatric community, and saying, you've declared war on us, we're declaring war on you. And within 2 years, the entire APA had changed its policies and its diagnosis of homosexuality as a mental disorder. So it just shows how disruptive tactics in organizing really do work. And that's just something that Frank Kameny would never have dreamed of admitting, even just 10 years prior.
Right, and you see the roots of ACT UP here, and you have so many things that are very familiar to us today, but this was really unusual for the time.
Straight line. I mean, really from going all the way back to the Gay Activist Alliance in New York and their tactics, and even before that in '69 in California, some of those same tactics were then used in ACT UP, like you said, and they worked.
They worked, yeah, they did. Okay, we're going to get to the end here so that we can get to the questions that we have from the audience. But there are a couple of things that I just found so moving, and I wanted to show them. One is the picture that we have of Frank Kameny you'll have to supply the year for this, Eric, I didn't write it down, but he's at the White House. And after so many years of fighting the government, here he is in the White House, and he's shaking hands with Barack Obama. And the event was giving benefits to partners of tell the story.
Yeah, so he had a great year in 2009. He went to the White House a few times. This occasion was the president was expanding health benefits for same-sex federal employees, and then he actually went back to receive an apology from the successor to the Civil Service Commission. And then a couple of years after that, he went back for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and he was sitting in the front row when that happened and wearing his infantry medal because he was a veteran himself.
Right. And then can we end now with the letter that he received from the Office of Personnel Management in 2009? Do you have that handy to read to the audience here?
Sure. This is actually from, his name's John Barry. He was the director of the Office of Personnel Management under Obama. He was actually openly gay himself. And so he said, "Dear Dr. Kameny, in what we now know was a shameful action, the United States Civil Service Commission in 1957 upheld your dismissal from your job solely on the basis of your sexual orientation. With the fervent passion of a true patriot, you did not resign yourself to the fate or quietly endure this wrong. With courage and strength, you fought back. Please accept our apology for the consequences of the previous policy of the United States government." And after Barry finished reading the letter, Kameny stood and simply said, "Apology accepted."
Wow, that's just, how many years was he waiting for that?
Was he dealing with the consequences of those 50 years?
Yeah, it's just incredible. Okay, One more picture for you. Well, get your thoughts together, people who might want to ask a question if you haven't done that already. And this is a picture that we were just sent here at the DC History Center last week when we, or at least last week or about that, when we posted the news of
Oh,
your,
perfect timing.
yeah, the news of this program. One of the photographers here in Washington, a woman named Ann Loico, sent us this picture. It's from 2011. It's from just a few months before Frank Kameny died.
Wow.
It's very timely, of course, today with what's going on in the House. But what really moved me when I saw this picture is that he was always fighting for the rights of individuals, and including the rights of the individuals who live in Washington, D.C. So we're very pleased now to have this as part of our collection here. Okay, I think we are now ready for some questions, and we're going to open up the list here so that we can choose some questions here. Okay. All right. First question, which could be a short one. How did the government learn that Kameny was homosexual, which led to his firing?
It's a great question. Context was, and I should have mentioned it, is at the center of the Lavender Scare was J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. It essentially acted as a clearinghouse between those local police departments that I mentioned that had those vice squads. Anytime there was a homosexual arrest, they would immediately funnel it to the FBI. Then the FBI would then cross-reference with various all federal employees to make sure that that arrest, that victim, was not employed in the federal government or did not have a security clearance. So what happened was Frank Kameny was at an astronomy conference in 1956 in San Francisco. He was in a public restroom standing next to another man. Something may or may not have happened. What we do know is there were two police officers in the ceiling watching, spying from behind a ventilation grill in the ceiling. And so he was arrested. It took a few months for it to get funneled to the FBI and then back to his civilian position in the Defense Department. But as soon as they found out, he was out like that.
Okay, thank you. Another question from, I'm going to read the names of the people who are asking the questions just because it's kind of fun, especially if they're people you know. Parker Johnson wants to know, would you say Kameny's preferred style of advocacy was right for his time? To a certain degree, it was very conformist, even compliant. As a queer cis man from rural Oklahoma, I often wonder about the toll that has taken on the queer community today.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and it's something I think about a lot, which is, what is the role of respectability as a political strategy? And one thing to keep in mind is, that can change. The answer to that question can change over time. So in 1961, when he first started his crusade, and he simply just wanted to get the job that he felt he deserved, or in 1965, when they organized that very first picket, another thing to remember that I think a lot of people forget is that respectability is also a survival mechanism, right? It's something that keeps people safe. And so when they first made that jump in 1964 and then 65 to picketing, to putting literally their bodies on the street, not knowing whether they would be attacked, I think that helped them make that psychological and physical leap. But then as soon as they realized that they were okay, right? And as soon as they realized that they were excluding people, it only took a few of those marches in 1965 before they started actively turning people away. If you showed up in drag or you were not conforming to gender norms, you would not have been able to march. And he was called out for it. And he refused to adapt. And I think that's where the answer becomes, he made a mistake. And I think that's ultimately why he, especially after Stonewall, got left behind, because he just wasn't willing to listen when people told him, you're leaving people behind. You're keeping the movement small by enforcing these gender norms, essentially, and enforcing rules. What if you didn't own a suit? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to put your body on the line? And I think if there's anything that studying the history of movements have told us, is even above looking respectable and getting into the room, you need numbers, right? That is what creates success. And so you look at, his trajectory versus, I'd encourage everyone to look up Jose Sarria in San Francisco, who was a drag queen who ran for office and got just as many votes as Frank Kameny did 10 years later, right, as a drag queen. And so it shows, how I think respectability politics, especially today, are in the end of the day really self-defeating, because you need to prove to your constituency that no matter how different you may be or how abhorrent you may be to the rest of society, you have a place within this movement. And I think that's something we got to be really mindful of, especially as we move forward.
Right. And something that I remember from the book, when Frank Kameny ran for Congress, he was being hyper respectable. And I think you noted in the book, obviously I didn't find it somewhere else, so it's from you, that he didn't get a very high number of votes from the gay community of Washington.
Right.
And
right.
Yeah, because he wasn't reaching everybody. Yeah.
Right.
It was in 1971, so that makes sense. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Another question for you, Eric. Did the tactics used during the Lavender Scare primarily target men, or were women targeted as well?
It's a bit of a complicated answer because the vast majority of the arrests during this time, which is really the information that the government is relying upon in order to carry out the Lavender Scare, were of men, right? Women, for the most part, were not cruising in Lafayette Park. That said, in the mind of the federal government, they were just as dangerous. So one great example is Lily Vincennes, who was still around. She was in the Women's Army Corps. She was simply spotted holding her girlfriend's hand. That was it, right? And all it took was one other person to rat her out, and she lost her job immediately. And she became the first lesbian to march in front of the White House with Frank. And so it just shows, of course, it may appear that one group was targeted more than another, but in the eyes of the oppressor, we're all equally detestable.
Okay. Another question. Can you comment on Kameny's Jewishness and how that influenced or didn't influence his actions?
He is what I think he would describe as culturally Jewish, but religiously atheist. And so one of my favorite interviews of all time, I hope somehow we're able to share it or reconstruct it, was one that David Johnson actually did in the 90s with his mother, who was, I believe, 100 at the time and drinking whiskey during the interview, who was very devoutly Jewish. And talked about his bar mitzvah and how important, that community was for him. And, I think it was that element of community that was so important for him as a child, and also feeling safe to kind of explore his own religious beliefs. And, at some point, I believe he was 13, he just sat his parents down and said, well, I've decided I'm an atheist. Like I've done a systematic evaluation of my beliefs, and I think I'm 100% there. And so his parents weren't very happy, but you can certainly tell culturally it was very important. And he, was very close to his mother, who was also very close to her faith. So I think, I would never write that off as an important influence. And so I think I want to find some way to share that interview, because it's so great.
Where is that interview?
David was kind enough to share it with me. He was just phenomenal in sharing some of those interviews. So maybe we can convince him to release it, because Edna Ray Kameny is like truly, she actually was one of the first, one of the parts of the book, I don't want to give too much away, but it was a hard time for her when he first came out in his 30s. He had already started the Mattachine and his lawsuit before coming out to his own mother. But she evolved over time and was one of the first members of PFLAG, of Parents of Gay Children, and actually marched with Frank in some of the early marches in the 1970s. And it's so heartwarming, and it just shows how important family is, and how great it can be in activism as well.
Okay. I have some more questions. I have a lot of questions here. Let's see. This, in your opinion, do you think there was misogyny and racism within the ECHO or NACO strategies? I'm going to have you explain what those two acronyms are for, along with their campaigns. As LGBTQ members, what responsibility do you think we should do to make this intersection notable?
Yeah, I mean, these were two of the first alliances of gay and lesbian organizations in the 1960s before Stonewall. And I think, and I use the past tense, but I think it applies to now as well. I think pre-Stonewall and post-Stonewall activism, with some exceptions, were predicated upon misogyny and racism. I think they utilized their whiteness and, for some of the male groups, their masculinity in order to advance their own causes as gay men, right? So, and you see it time and time again when you read the words of Del Martin, who ultimately left the homophile movement for for the women's liberation, because she said, you know what, I have so much more to gain by fighting first as a woman than I do as fighting for a homosexual, which has been conflated with being a white male homosexual. And she had been making those arguments since 1959, before Frank was even part of the movement. She was calling out the Mattachine, which was first started here in Los Angeles in 1950, saying, you men only care about the problems of the men. What about women who are married with families who then get divorced and are trying to live their lives as lesbians? What about them? Are we doing anything for on that front, or for employment of lesbian women? And so it just shows how time and time again people are left behind. And so I think our duty, especially someone like me, who's benefited from all that, is I think we have the moral responsibility to say, all right, first, who did we leave behind, and what can I do to make that history right?
Okay. Another question here from, I think it says Steve Honley. You referenced David Johnson's The Lavender Scare, but you seem to emphasize that you're looking at the subject from a contrasting angle. So he says, could you clarify whether you find Johnson's work to be superseded or inadequate? And then he says, while you're getting your thoughts together, full disclosure, I'm a retired Fed myself, though I served long after that period, and nearly every gay government employee I know of Kameny's generation thinks very highly of the Lavender Scare. So.
Oh, it's wonderful. I'm laughing because I actually got the exact same question from my PhD dissertation and defense committee, asking me to differentiate. And so David, what's so foundational about his book is it's the Lavender Scare. So it really tells from even the 1940s, even before that, through 1950s, up until and including Frank Kameny. So Frank doesn't really come until the very last chapter. And so he really introduced him, I think, in some of his tactics, without getting into the weeds too much into the activism and exactly how Frank as a person changed, and how the Mattachine changed and how the whole country changed in the 1960s. He kind of cuts to the chase and it explains why he's so important. And so I went for more depth, I think, in that one section, and said, hey, we need a whole book on Frank Kameny. So I think they're perfect. If you read my book and you say, I want to learn a lot more about the history of the Lavender Scare and kind of the politics behind it, go pick it up, or vice versa. If you read that first and then want more on Frank Kameny, he's such a wonderful scholar and truly laid the groundwork for this book.
All right. This is from an anonymous attendee. It says, as a queer person researching violence against queer people, did that impact your mental health at all during the research process? How did you approach this material?
It's a great question. And, I have to say, I think we all, as queer folks, we all go through varying levels of trauma. I will say, as someone in the 21st century studying the century prior and seeing what these people had to go through, and the fact, reading their diaries, reading their letters to one another. A lot of it I didn't make it into the book, but that's what I was doing. At the end of the day, I was sitting there holding their letters or their diaries, many of whom passed away from AIDS, and just seeing the sheer amount of joy and love that they were able to find despite those circumstances. That's what I held on to. Because it just showed me, especially this year, right, this past 13, 14 months, right, that in some of the worst circumstances possible, losing your job, losing your family, being targeted, arrested, beaten by the police, they still had community and love and were able to thrive, not just survive, but thrive. And so I think that's what history does for me. And of course, there's so many tragedies within it, but really looking for and holding on to those bits and pieces of joy. I think that's what got me through it. And frankly, what keeps me going now and what gets me so excited about studying history, because it shows us a path forward.
Another question here from Anonymous. Kameny took on a very powerful opponent when he challenged the civil service. He might have had better luck earlier if he had enlisted some support in Congress. Did he try to do that, and did he succeed?
Someone's got to read the book. It was the first thing he did. So before he even contemplated marching in the streets or filing lawsuits, even first thing he did was actually he wrote to various congressmen and senators, including Senator Johnson, LBJ, who was chairing America's Space Committee, the very first, right? Because that was the committee that oversaw his department. And so that simply didn't work. All the elected officials were assured by the bureaucrats that he was afforded due process, that they followed all the rules, which they had. Even the ACLU, whom he went to, told him, oh, they followed all the rules. It's fair game. You're gay. You're not allowed in the government. Sorry, no civil liberties to be seen. And so then once his lawsuit failed and he started the Mattachine, that was also their first thing. They really started as a lobbying organization, and they actually sat down with two congressmen who ended up being quite valuable allies, but they just weren't able to get the legislative support they needed to get any sort of change. Because remember, if there's anything that was bipartisan in the 50s and 60s, it was that homosexuals had no place in civil society, especially the federal government. So that was just completely bipartisan. And he, in fact, witnesses it for himself once he testifies in Congress in 1963 and just sees the magnitude of legislative opposition to his aims.
There's another question from Adina Norwood. She wants to know, how were LGBTQ individuals contacted for research and community outreach when it was so dangerous to be out in past society? How safe and reliable were underground communities in DC?
Research and community outreach back in the day or now?
I think it's back
in the day. Well, thankfully, there was an underground world, mostly in the form of the bars. And so Frank really was embedded himself in bar culture, kind of like I mentioned in the reading. And so he was very much a part of that gay underground world, and then simply tried to utilize that to create a movement. And so the people who were willing and able to go to gay bars then made they composed his activist organization. So that's where the problem of the segregation that I mentioned in the reading really came into play, because if he was only going to white gay bars, then of course his organization was almost entirely white. And so it just shows how, de facto segregation of public spaces can also translate over to grassroots organizing. And it's something that I think we as activists today, who still are confronting de facto segregation in our major cities, that's something we need to realize when we're organizing or marching is, where are we looking to actually build these activist organizations, and are we really creating a representative, diverse community of activists?
Right. And as you said before, are you going to get the biggest numbers if you
Right.
don't?
Yep.
Okay, and another question, switching gears a little bit. Thank you so much for your thoughtfulness, for the thoughtfulness you've brought to this work and presentation. Could you talk a little bit more about how Kameny's records got to the Library of Congress?
Yes, it's actually a huge saga. I talk about it a little bit in the acknowledgments of the book, and you might even, like on Google Books or something, be able to fast forward to it to kind of see the provenance of it. He was living in near destitution towards the end of his life. He truly had nothing. He was living on donations of food from friends. And two men, Charles Francis and Bob Whittick, were longtime DC residents and activists, came up with this, frankly, an ingenious solution, which was they realized he had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents in plastic trash bags in his attic that were literally the hidden history of American gay rights. And they said that must be worth something. So they had it appraised. They created a nonprofit called the Kameny Papers Project, which I believe still has a website. If you Google it, it's Kameny Papers Project. .org, and they had it appraised. They raised money. It was a good amount of money, and then bought them from Frank, and then the nonprofit donated it to the Library of Congress. So it was a very creative way of giving money to Frank for the last years of his life, which he was able to survive on, and also donating them to the public. And I'd encourage anyone to get it. I also, maybe I can type it somehow. I digitized tens of thousands of documents and want other people to use them. So if you can't make it to the Library of Congress, if you go to, let me see if I can type it here. It's called thedeviantarchive.org. You should be able to view a huge number of them. Hopefully it still works. And it's totally open source. I hope there's so many more books that need to be written on Frank and queer activism in DC. And so I hope it helps.
Thank you. That's great. I have a comment here from Timothy Hannapel. He says, one of the really beautiful aspects of Frank's life is how it came full circle from being fired and humiliated to being honored many decades later. I was lucky enough to convene a panel at the Lavender Law Conference in 1999 on LGBT federal employee rights, and Frank agreed to be on a panel with several Clinton LGBT appointees, including John Barry. 10 years later, Barry was Obama's OPM director and issued the formal apology to Frank on behalf of the US government. I'm so glad to see this adding to the history here. And it's such a pleasure to be doing this talk in Washington, where we have an audience who actually not only understands our topic, but was there. That's very great. Thank you for sharing that story. I think what I'm going to do now is ask one final question of my own, because we are running short of time. We're actually over time. Eric, what is it that you are doing now professionally? Why are you in Los Angeles? Tell us the story.
Well, to go full circle, it all started with watching a film of a gay activist named Harvey Milk. And I strongly believe, and I believe since I first discovered Frank's papers, there needs to be something that we can consume as a whole country or the whole world easier than a 500-page book about him. And so stay tuned for news about that, and also just trying to find other stories from queer history to share on TV. So there should be news about that soon. And yeah, I think there's so many more stories that need to be told. So if anyone listening is interested in academia or finding ways of doing their own historical research, please don't hesitate to reach out, because there are just infinite stories out there that still need to be told, and I'd be happy to help.
Okay, well, that's really generous of you, and thank you so much. I'm going to ask everybody to stick around for a couple of more minutes because I have some announcements to make. But I always feel funny saying thank you to the speaker, to the author, to the historian, and then continuing to talk about the DC History Center. But I'm going to do that. I just feel compelled to thank you right now, Eric, because that was truly inspiring. And I think you explained a lot of things to a lot of people who now need to go and get the book. And We are pleased to tell you that we are selling it here at the DC History Center store. So you can go online here and order your copy. And our copies are autographed. We have these lovely book plates that Eric signed. That's how you do it in the modern world. So we hope you'll consider getting a book or two or three of Eric Cervini's The Deviant's War. In a few days also, this program that we've just done is going to be available with closed captioning on YouTube, our YouTube channel. So please feel free to share that with your networks and friends, and come back and watch again if you want to see something, if you want to hear something again that you didn't catch the first time around. Also, if you would take a look at our website, we have a page called Context for Today. And on that webpage, we have sources on, I'm not going to say LGBTQ, I'm going to say queer history in DC. And you can see on that page the links that have appeared in the chat window as we've been unfolding our talk here. Our next talk in the series, also moderated by an editor of Washington History Magazine, will be on May 5th. And it will be with the authors of Between Freedom and Equality, The History of an African-American Family in Washington, D.C. You're all going to want to see this. It's a terrific story. I believe it's 6 generations of Washingtonians, beginning with an enslaved man who was working on George Washington's canal project in the 1790s and bought his freedom. And there's so much more to learn about this family. So that's on May 5th. And also, we at the nonprofit DC History Center are very grateful to each of you who made a donation when you registered for tonight's program. Those dollars go directly to producing this program and future programs like it. The DC History Center also gratefully recognizes support from Events DC and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And now I would like to thank you again, Eric, for giving us your time and your creativity this evening. Behind the scenes, I am grateful for the work of Ricky Abuleus, Laura Brower-Haygood, Maggie Downing, Katrina Ingram, Ann McDonough, Kimmy Ram9, and Tamora Wright, and Marin Orchard, who all contributed to this program. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you on May 5th. Good night.
Thanks so much, Jane.